let's start with the panel discussion. And Raivo, could you join us here? And I think, oh, let's do that. But I'll take the privilege of being a moderator and sort of asking the first question to start off the panel, but also trying to tie this panel discussion a bit more to the general topic of this conference. So all of you in your presentations, what you have highlighted very nicely is the kind of importance of different local power structures and paradigms in the ways in which we make sense of integration. So I would like us to think a bit more about the differences in Western and Eastern European historical experiences and the kind of possible implications this might have not only in the ways in which we conceptualize integration, but also what are the kind of possibilities for rethinking the concept and moving forward. So as all of you know, this conference looks at the last 30 years of integration in Estonia. So in other words, it's kind of from the time point when Estonia regains its independence. And why this is important for this question as well is that before that, Estonians, as many other nations in the Soviet Union, in many ways, they were a minority culture. So after the kind of re-independence occurred, integration happened in parallel with the nation-building project, and kind of free-framing in your mind how to go from being a minority to a majority. So this is very different from many Western European countries we have talked about who have a long history of imperial legacies. And it kind of, this historical baggage has created the situations where when we talk about Western European, perhaps context, Adrian, you mentioned as well, this kind of global dominance. In Estonia and Eastern Europe, it's more about culture survival. So my question to all of you, and I think perhaps we can start with our international speakers and then come back to Raivo, who has worked in this context for so long, is what do you think, in which ways these differences in countries' experiences and colonial legacies influence the ways in which integration can be conceptualized and operationalized? So perhaps, Lea, I'll give a floor to you first.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question, and it also makes me extra happy to be here, actually, because it gives me a reason and to reflect on this. While giving my own presentation, I basically realized again how political philosophy aims to be this kind of abstracted from a specific national context, and my framework is not built on a specific national context, but at the same time it is clearly infused with all kinds of experiences, and that experiences that are actually very local. And I think that Professor Favel was very right in pointing out that this debate about integration in the field that I have been immersed in the last couple of years has been very much focused on this Western, North American, North European idea of integration, in which there's this self-image of having a long democratic liberal history and immigration kind of tempering with that, and integration is all about kind of, is very much framed in these terms of this history, and I can completely imagine that it must be very different in the Estonian context. Yeah, so for me, this would, I hate to say it, but for me this is more a reflection on my own work than I feel like I have very specific points to say about the Estonian situation in this way. So I really hope that Professor Zatic can add to that.
Professor Favel, maybe, and then we can move on to Raivo's response.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nice summary from Lea in a way about how the the particular position of sitting in Western Europe, reflecting on these questions, has a lot of assumptions built into it. That's obviously what I wanting to stress as well. I think we underestimate the influence of American ideas on what we're discussing. I mean, it's no accident. We're talking obviously that Canadian scholars continually in debates about multiculturalism, like John Berry, Will Kimlicka, and so on, but also that in a more broader sense that European societies have moved towards a kind of American model of society over the decades of the post-war, as a kind of globalized neoliberalism has become the only game in town. And so I like to sort of reiterate those kinds of points in this context. How that affects looking at Estonia and its particular balance of majority-minority relations. A lot of the questions here are not even about immigrants as such, but about the place of minorities in a national society. One of the points would be that integration policies still focus on building ideas about integration that are implicitly about native populations, and who becomes the native and who are the natives is always a key question in identifying the benchmarks and the standard models to which people are supposed to be integrating. And we get up then the dangerous construction of majority and minority groups as separate groups as opposed to groups that may have different sorts of cross-cutting links or socioeconomic relations, class positions, other aspects of culture, gender, diversity, etc. that may offer different ways in which the society can work. But I'd certainly want to reiterate that I think we'd need to think about the position of relatively peripheral East European examples in relation to this kind of dominant model that I'm suggesting has this power, and not automatically translate conclusions across from the West to these positions, because things look different positionally always. And this is related, I think, to the differential power in global hierarchies that I think is indexed by the power of the passport and by the power of certain nationalities at the top of the global hierarchy. There was one point I wanted to raise about Estonia that I think we ought to bring into this, is that I think a key part of the integration question in Estonia ought to be thinking about Estonians abroad. And we would rethink a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the obvious positivity of integration in the national context. If we ask questions about do we want Estonians abroad to be integrating into Britain or integrating into France? Probably not from an Estonian point of view, because they are migrant populations that have been lost to the nation and that get extracted and incorporated into some other society if they become integrated over there. And I think the implication of that is that we want transnational populations to in fact be conduits for the dissolving, in some sense, of the inherent attractive power of countries like Britain or France as receiving nations. And that's the external dimension I think we can bring into integration that I think can have helpful effects in helping us rethink what we mean by integration.
Absolutely. But Raivo, from your experience as well, working in the field of integration, being exposed to this Western kind of academia as well, I'm interested to kind of hear how you've been able to translate then these ideas to a local context and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you. It is a great question in a sense that it highlights a point Adrian made, that integration is inherently contextual. And in the Estonian case, your question was colonial background. Estonia used to be colonized. We were part of the Soviet Union. And let us try to recall what was going on in Estonia in 1980s in respect of integration. Within Soviet Union, there was also idea about integration, friendship of nations, Soviet citizen, Soviet person, etc., etc., and Estonian reaction to this Soviet type of integration concept was to pressure on the notion of multiplicity, pluralism, difference, etc. We wanted to maintain our own culture. We wanted to be different from Russia. We were not Soviets, etc., etc. This was our colonial context. Now, very interesting shift occurred in the beginning of 1990s when Estonia regained independence. After that, I think very, very fast, we totally reversed our view of integration. In Soviet time, we pushed on the notion of plurality. In the beginning of Estonian Republic, we immediately started to push on the notion of homogeneous ethnic nation. The idea, even official idea, was that, those persons who came to Estonia during Soviet time, why not to migrate back to Russia, from where they came from. So, understanding of integration is absolutely contextual. One day you have one idea, second day you have another idea, and the third day, which was at the end of 1990s in Estonia, in the context of accession to the European Union, what Estonia did, Estonia adopted a kind of Western liberal concept of integration, and after that, I would say that there is not much maybe colonial impact, but now there is impact of what is going on in the EU, what is going on globally, and from my point of view, actually one very important moment was economic recession. 10 to 12 years ago, a huge event which actually showed to everybody that we are on wrong track globally, everybody, and in this context, in Estonia, also integration thinking changed again, and we moved to this relationalist type of conceptualization of integration.
I think definitely sort of with the financial crisis, but also in, since then, the context has started to change quite a lot, partly as well, again, me drifting back to the immigration flows, it is this kind of growth in different types of migration flows to Estonia as well, but elsewhere, the diversification of different groups. So perhaps another topic I would like us to kind of think about links to these kind of changes in immigration flows, because obviously in an Estonian context, when we think about 15 to 20 years ago, it was much more kind of dual, minority, majority. Now you're seeing a diversification of different groups, sort of diversity of power relations coming into play. But I want to ask, again, this is kind of directed to all of the speakers here, is because these immigration policy changes and this move towards selectivity policies that Professor Favel with the best and the brightest highlighted as well, that we see everywhere. How does this come into play into integration field? Because obviously the new migrants we're selecting, they come with their own kind of capital-rich attributes, their skills. When we look at investor visas, they might come with financial capital. So how does this actually kind of come into play in terms of this power dynamic or the relations? Because they're not. We can't look at migrants anymore from this kind of lens of lack, because very often they come from a class position that's quite similar, if not even superior to the average local. So perhaps, Raiva, maybe you can, with the Estonian situation, because you said with the financial crisis, the differences, how does this kind of come into play in your work or what you've seen?
Yeah, okay, let us try to think all together what is going on in Estonia. My understanding is that, yeah, migration is definitely rising, but probably we do not have so much skilled migrants in Estonia to say that this makes difference for a kind of general perception of what is going on in Estonia. I think Estonia is still very much focused on this dualistic Estonians, Russians differentiation. Of course, step by step, the numbers of new migrants are coming, but I would say that, and this is different from Western Europe, where yeah, this is a question of future. I don't see big changes right now.
In the coming, okay. But Leah, perhaps from you, because you were talking about these kind of, relations between different individuals, kind of when reframing integration, how does this kind of power dynamics and the class dimension then come into play there?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I recognize what you say, that also in the Netherlands, politically, there are very different expectations when it comes to integration with what has been classified as highly skilled and lowly skilled migrants coming in. There's also different formal requirements for what one has to do to get a visa or to actually stay in the Netherlands. So there is, politically, we see this idea that lowly skilled migrants need help, they need to adjust, they need to be elevated in order to be capable of functioning in Dutch society. And the highly skilled migrants, their integration is not questioned to the same extent. They don't need to jump through the same hoops, they don't need to take the same tests, they don't need to take the same courses in order to be qualified as a participant in Dutch society. So there you see a very classist notion of who is allowed to come in, and also what kind of requirements there are once you want to stay in the Netherlands. But then on the other hand, I think culturally we also see here a stigmatization of the expat, particularly by politicians and people who oppose migration in general. So there's this image of the expat as someone who is very unattached from Dutch society, who kind of leeches on the possibilities that Dutch society offers without giving back. So I think this classist notion works on the one hand in a political sense, that it eases access for some over others, and we come with this kind of selective migration where we want highly skilled migrants kind of to make the Dutch country better. And on the other hand, we also see resistance to that. So I think it's a very ambiguous role that class plays here.
Adrian, you have written about the Eurostars and these highly mobile, skilled people. How does this, if this is kind of expanding much further to more countries, how do you see this reshaping thoughts about social cohesion?
Yeah, so high-skilled migrants and intra-EU migrations, which are often in a more middling kind of range, I think contribute to the super diversity that's being identified here. This diversification, could be called, could be talked about as well in terms of what some scholars talk about as super diversity. And it does offer certain sorts of resources for opening up the typical box of talking about immigration and integration and majority-minority relations, because it effectively does create all of these different sorts of socio-economic, class, culture, positions that open up, I think, these relational possibilities that we're we're talking about. And I think the UK is rather similar to the Netherlands, I think, on many of these points. And it's interesting to see how even the high-skilled, the free-floating, the expats in some contexts also become a target for integrationist talk or moves, because the kind of idea of having to learn languages or integrate, which I think it illustrates some of the powers that the nation state really does have still in shaping all kinds of migrants. But a lot of the time the position of higher skilled migrants is linked to the ability to be fairly invisible and fairly free-flowing across borders that continue to be porous, at the same time as other sorts of efforts of integration are being focused on very particular kinds of populations. And I think it's also symptomatic that in a lot of the turn towards more populist neo-nationalist politics across Europe, that there has been this focus on the so-called indigenous working class national populations who become the symbolic repository of kind of national public opinion. This is very clear obviously with Brexit in Britain, but it's been clear I think across Europe in this kind of populist tendency. And it's interesting, of course, that those populations are also being pictured as highly integrated populations. They're integrated nationals who represent the true voice of the natives and the true voice of the nation, and yet, in fact, on all kinds of other socioeconomic measures and in terms of the way in which society is stratified and divided, they are not integrated at all, in any kind of Durkheimian sense. So it's the symbolic politics around that also, I think, that is interesting, which again is the same point again about how we project integration onto particular sorts of benchmark populations in order to not really examine their social position, but rather take them as the standard for somebody else.
Yeah. I wanted to ask if there are any questions in the room here. If not, I kind of, as a final discussion point, I guess, because we have 5 minutes left here, I wanted to kind of explore, because some of the questions that have come in, they talk about this kind of, is it feasible, even the breakdown of hierarchies? Is this even a possibility that, natives and migrants see themselves together? But I would like to kind of tie this question more to the topic of, because all the panels that follow this session, they deal with different practical elements. So my kind of question is that if we try to move towards a more equitable system, where should we start with? Where should we kind of, obviously, we're not going to start a revolution of breakdown of all hierarchies, but where the practitioners in the room could take steps to create a system that's better for migrants, but also for people in local communities. And perhaps, Lea, I'll give you the floor.
I think this is always a very hard question because, well, I think as Professor Pavel so rightly pointed out, that any form of striving for bounded equality within a certain unit immediately excludes a lot of people, so kind of reinforces inequality between this unit and the rest of the world. And then the question is, what is the most pressing problem, right? What is the level that we start to strive for equality? So whereas theoretically, I would say that this problem and the prominence of the passport and the ways in which nation states reinforce global inequality is kind of the biggest skill, most pressing problem. It also seems the most out of reach in terms of where should practitioners start to make a difference. So theoretically, that will be my answer. Practically, I think that the way forward in terms of integration and equality is really that we need to kind of let go of a lot of standards of what is normal, of what is good, of what should be attained, and I think the first step for a new form of integration policy would be to let go of a lot of ideas and of norms of what should be achieved, and to start looking from what is there instead. So how do people relate to each other? What do people bring to the table in terms of being a society together? How can we make people flourish within a society, rather than how can we make them adjust and capable and good enough to function? So that is still a rather abstract notion, I understand that, but I think that would be a direction to take.
Raiva, maybe I'll give
No.
for a brief overview.
Yeah, more equality. How to achieve more equality? The problem here is that equality is essentially contested concept. There is no one homogeneous equality. Equality is always along certain criteria, and criteria are different, so we get a kind of conflicting understandings of equality, and yeah, this is a kind of discursive mean to try to defend your interest in the field. Yeah, one opportunity would be, I guess maybe Adrian would, or my understanding of what Adrian said, to integrate society, stop talking about integration. Now, maybe Adrian will comment later on that. But in practical terms, yeah, integration is contextual. If you take Estonian context, from my point of view, the most pressing issue is educational reform in Estonia. Estonia regained independence 30 years ago, and we started our reform, unifying educational system, and we are still doing it. I think this is a major issue which is against getting more equality in Estonian labour market. And the other issue, from my point of view as well, is the issue of statelessness. 30 years ago, Estonian laws created massive statelessness, and still we have, not so massive anymore, but still 70,000 or so stateless persons. From my point of view, this also is a very big obstacle to Estonian society to achieve more equality.
And Adrian, your last thoughts on how to make theory, how to transfer theory into practice?
Yeah, so there's a general message really about including within integration questions external issues. The external, it's not just about the receiving society, and it's not just about the migrants themselves who happen to be in our receiving society, but it's about the societies that they came from and the kind of inequality that is embedded in the relation between the receiving and the sending society. And it's, I think also the issue of external migrants from a society like Estonia is also important. Integration, I'm suggesting that Estonian migrants abroad are part of the integration question, or it would reframe things to think about it in those terms. And yeah, you know, I think the big issue is very much about global inequalities. It's about migration and development type issues, and you know, integration is not something that can be created top down by states. You know, if there are going to be aspects of social change, it will happen from the consequences of migration and migrants and others pushing for certain things. And I do think one of the implications of what I'm saying is that the capacity of nation states is to receive migrants is much bigger than anybody thinks. So as soon as we start calculating thresholds of integration or trying to match immigrants to the receiving society and so forth, it becomes a political and symbolic issue, whereas the capacities are much greater, and the capacities of Western societies to give up some of their wealth to the rest of the world is also, much greater, of course, than it is. I mean, these are obvious issues in some sense, in an economic developmental sense, but it's quite extraordinary how I do think a lot of the debate about immigrant integration is trying to preserve and sustain a certain sort of privilege of highly advanced societies that are trying to justify not having to give up more than they really should, things that might affect the broader global hierarchy, and particularly the hierarchy of citizenship, as demonstrated in the value of passports.
Thank you. Did I see that there was a question in the room? I believe you need a microphone, if there is. Okay. Okay, sorry. It seems to me that there were some technical difficulties as well. So if there isn't a microphone at the moment as well, maybe we can figure out the question perhaps later in writing. But at this point, I would like to thank all the panelists. I really think this was a kind of insightful beginning that problematized the status quo quite a lot. So there is plenty to discuss over the next 2 days, how to find feasible solutions, and how to find feasible solutions also that are contextually appropriate to Estonia. So thank you very much. We have a break now, and then we will return after this, and hopefully technological issues are solved. But thank you so much, Lea, Adrian, Raivo. It was fantastic. Thank you.